COINTELPRO Papers, Chapter 4, COINTELPRO, Puerto Rican Independence Movement. Agents of the FBI's Domestic Intelligence Division should bear in mind that the attitudes expressed by the President, the Director, and many legislatures and Congress have been to curtail the militant actions on the part of a significant group of people in the United States today. The thinking of the Supreme Court of the United States has been along the lines of suppressing the activities of those who openly advocate the overthrow of democratic authority in the United States. In addition, the Internal Security Division of the Department of Justice has been specifically enlarged and strengthened to deal with these matters. J. Edgar Hoover, 1970. On February 27, 1946, D. Milton Ladd, head of the FBI's Intelligence Division, wrote a memorandum to J. Edgar Hoover recommending the Bureau cut back its operations in Puerto Rico, specifically accepting counterintelligence measures aimed at, quote, communists and members of the Nationalist Party on the island. The memo emerged from the context of relations developed by the U.S. with its small Caribbean neighbor during the period since the former assumed direct ownership of the latter in 1899 after the Spanish-American War. The United States had to make the Spanish feel their loss from the war. Because Spain had no cash left, as U.S. plenipotentiary Whitelaw Reid put it, no indemnity was possible, save in territory. We thought of taking Cuba, but desolated by 12 years of its own anti-colonialist war, the country wasn't worth much. That left Puerto Rico. Having acquired the island through conquest, the federal government set out to determine how the new possession should be managed. The result of more than a year of congressional debate was the Foraker Act of 1900. 31 Statute 77, named after Senator Thomas B. Foraker, its sponsor, which was Congress's first essay in crafting the so-called Organic Acts that were to govern Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico became a new constitutional animal, an unincorporated territory subject to the absolute will of Congress, a colonial status that was recognized by the insular cases by the Supreme Court. Representative James D. Richardson's observations on Hawaii were quoted in the debate on the Foraker Act. Quote, nations have always acted and should govern themselves at all times upon principles which are entirely different from those which activate individuals. In looking at the question of any foreign territory, the only question that should enter into consideration by us is one question. Is it best for the United States? The weal or woe, the misery or happiness, the poverty or prosperity of the foreigner or those to be annexed is not involved. With this self-enabling legislation in hand, the U.S. next installed a puppet government to administer its new colony. This consisted of a governor and an executive council appointed by the President of the United States, who also appointed all the justices of the Supreme Court. With a government under its total control in place, the customs duty on Puerto Rican goods was removed by Congress, dependent for exports of its products, free of duty to the mainland. The island became a regional economy of the United States. Thus, by 1901, the Foraker Act had set the essential framework of the U.S. connection. The political framework might be enlarged in the direction of home rule in an endeavor to remove the stigma of colonialism. The economic bond would work against any final severance of permanent political union with the metropolitan power. At first, the island response was to follow U.S. stipulated procedural forms in attempting to alter the political-economic equation. By 1916, however, Puerto Rican sentiment against the nature of federal rule has risen to a point which caused Washington to reveal just how meaningless its quote-unquote due process really was. Concerned that a scheduled referendum on the imposition of U.S. citizenship and the military draft might result instead in an overwhelming vote for complete independence, President Woodrow Wilson arbitrarily suspended balloting until July 1917. After passage of the Jones Act, 39th Statute 951, unilaterally conferred citizenship and its attendant obligations upon the island populace, regardless of Puerto Rican desires. As to any prospect of eventual independence, the House Committee on Interior and Insular Affairs proclaimed that, quote, our people have already decided Puerto Rico is forever to remain part of the United States. Under such conditions, an increasing number of Puerto Ricanos turned to non-electoral means of changing their circumstances. Following in the tradition of Hermón Ementero Betances, one of the few island leaders who openly advocated complete separation from Spain prior to 1898, the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, NPPR, was founded in 1922. Pedro Albizu Campos became its president in 1930, quote-unquote, injecting it with his radical nationalism. Rejecting elections as a, quote, a periodic farce to keep the Puerto Rican family divided, Albizu called for a strategy of direct action to achieve full national sovereignty. The federal response was to launch a campaign of repression against the independentistas, a matter for which the government was equipped with an on-site military, primarily naval presence, the island's National Guard, and the local colonial police apparatus working in direct liaison with the FBI, which maintained a field office in San Juan, as well as resident agencies in Ponce, Aguadilla, and Fajardo. Although the Bureau's counterintelligence role in the events occurring in Puerto Rico during the 30s is sketchy at best, Ladd's memo provides firm indication that it was an active one, and that Albizu's followers were a particular target. The island's police commander, Colonel Frank Riggs, announced that his men were in a, quote, state of war to the death with all Puerto Ricans. In the face of this, Albizu proclaimed a quid pro quo of sorts. For every nationalist killed, a continental American would die. Hence, when the police fired into a crowd of student demonstrators, killing 5 from the University of Puerto Rico at Rio Piedras on October 24, 1935, the NPPR replied by assassinating Riggs himself. Albizu wanted revolution, but the United States tried to prevent one by holding the next face-off, not in the streets, but in the courts. On March 7, 1936, federal authorities, read the FBI, raided nationalist headquarters, collected quote-unquote compromising evidence, and collected Albizu Campos and 7 of his closest colleagues as well. The charge was sedition. The penalty, if convicted, was a long stretch in a mainland, never a Puerto Rican prison. As Ronald Fernandez has observed, since 8 Americans and 4 Puerto Ricans failed to reach a consensus, the first trial ended in a hung jury. So in the second trial, federal officials took no chances. They stacked the jury with 12 safe people. 10 were Americans, 2 were Puerto Ricans, and together they produced a verdict which federal prosecutors found satisfactory. Official opinion held that the 2 to 10-year sentences meted out to Albizu and most of the other NPPR leadership ought to go far to restore order and tranquility on the island. This assessment undoubtedly seemed all the more solid to the government insofar as the prosecution's need to gather evidence for the sedition trial had been used as the basis from which to undertake the first use of grand jury proceedings to harass, intimidate, and cripple an organized national liberation movement. Specifically at issue in this regard was the sentencing on April 2, 1936, to a year in federal prison of the then Secretary General of the Nationalist Party, Puerto Rican poet Juan Antonio Correger, for contempt and refusing to surrender to the grand jury the minutes and list of members of the party. However, exactly the opposite occurred. Indeed, after the Federal Court of Appeals upheld Albizu's conviction in February 1937, Puerto Rico witnessed what is quite accurately referred to as a massacre of nationalist supporters. To show solidarity with Albizu, his followers planned a parade in Ponce. Heavily armed police blocked off every street in the vicinity. A shot rang out. Within minutes, 20 civilians, some just bystanders, had been killed and more than 150 wounded. Despite government contentions that the NPPR itself was responsible for the bloodbath, the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, after an exhaustive investigation, concluded The facts show that the affair of March 21st, 1937, in Ponce was a massacre due to the denial by police of the civil rights of citizens to parade and assemble. This denial was ordered by the U.S. appointed governor of Puerto Rico. Badly battered, the independentistas responded with a rapid series of reprisals before withdrawing into an extended period of regroupment. In June 1937, two nationalists tried to kill the federal judge who presided at Albizu's trial. During a rally at which Puerto Rico's resident commissioner defended the use of the American flag, two nationalists tried to kill him. And on July 25, 1938, at a parade celebrating the 40th anniversary of the American takeover, Albizu's followers tried to assassinate Governor Blanton Winship by firing more than 80 shots at the reviewing stand. Somehow, Winship escaped injury, but his bodyguard was wounded and a colonel in the National Guard was killed by a stray bullet. With Albizu in prison, he ultimately served more than 18 years behind federal bars before dying of radiation-induced cancer in 1965. The MPPR underwent a period of intense internal turmoil. The extent to which FBI infiltration facilitated its resultant fragmentation is unclear, but again, Ladd's memo suggests some such involvement. In any event, effectively leaderless and undoubtedly tired of incessant discord and infighting, a significant portion of the membership had, by 1945, drifted toward the softer and more realistic position of advocating Commonwealth status rather than full independence for Puerto Rico, a posture advanced by the liberal Luis Muñoz Marin and his Partido Popular Democrático, PPD, founded in 1938. This erosion was offset to some extent by the formation of a caucus calling itself the Congreso Pro Independentista, CPI, which by 1946 had largely merged with the Concepcion de Garcia's Partido Independentista Puertorriqueño, PIP. The general flow away from the MPPR appears to have been what the federal government had in mind at a counterintelligence level, and Ladd's memo suggesting that pressure might be removed from all those other than the active communists and or nationalists should be viewed as a way of quote-unquote encouraging defection. By 1948, Muñoz Marin, posing himself as an quote-unquote alternative to the violence of the independentistas, was able to win Puerto Rico's first elected governorship on the basis of a promise that he could negotiate a favorable resolution to the island's political status question with federal policymakers. But Congress had absolutely no intention of letting Puerto Rico go. That the United States wanted to retain its colony was made clear to Muñoz on his frequent trips to Washington, and in the end he settled for what Congress was willing to give. Testifying before the House in March 1950, Muñoz was reduced to repeatedly telling congressmen what they wanted to hear, that he and the PPD would willingly bow to the authority of their colonizers in exchange for approval of a constitution which was itself utterly subordinate to the will of the U.S. By this point, even the mainstream Puerto Rican press was attacking Muñoz as a sellout. It was into this scene of perceived betrayal on the part of many Puerto Ricanos that Pedro Albizu Campos returned after a full decade of incarceration. Immediately, he informed the independentistas that, quote, the Nationalist Party, which he sought to revitalize, is going to dynamite America and expel the Yankees from Puerto Rico. The day always comes when justice arms the weak and puts the giants to flight. Then another Te Deum shall be sung, but it will be preceded by armed struggle. On October 30th, 1950, a group of approximately 2,000 nationalists orchestrated uprisings throughout the island. In the mountains, the nationalists not only took over the town of Yayua, they used it as a temporary capital for the sovereign Republic of Puerto Rico. In San Juan, Muñoz was lucky to be alive. Armed with machine guns and Molotov cocktails, 5 nationalists had entered La Fortaleza, the governor's residence, intent upon killing him and blowing up the structure that had always been a potent symbol of colonialism. Munoz Marin would-be executioners were killed and the revolt put down with considerable direct U.S. military involvement, but 2 days after the attack on La Fortaleza, two New York nationalists, Oscar Collazo and Griselio Torresola, took a train to Washington. They meant to kill President Truman, but when they spotted guards at the entrance to Blair House, Truman's temporary residence, Collazo opened fire, and within seconds, Terrasola and a police officer were dead. Examining Terrasola's body, police found letters from Albizu Campos. Although they said nothing explicit about an assassination, they led to Albizu's arrest and imprisonment. This was followed on March 4th, 1954, by four independentistas managing to smuggle a gun into the House of Representatives, where they were able to wound 5 congressmen before running out of ammunition. As in the late 1930s, the momentum achieved by the NPPR could not be sustained. Exhaustion and factionalism once again took their toll during the late 50s, as the independentistas splintered into such smaller student organizations as the Federación de Universitarios Pro Independencia, FUPI, and Federación Estudiantil Pro Independencia, FEPI, a high school level group, as well as proliferating number of sectarian grouplets like the Acción Patriótica Revolucionaria, APR, and Movimiento 27 de Marzo, each committed to continuing the armed struggle on its own terms. As is the case with the 1940s, the precise role of FBI infiltration, disinformation, and so forth in helping this disintegration process along is murky, but subsequent Bureau memoranda allude to the fact that active counterintelligence operations were occurring at some level. Meanwhile, the PIP's increasingly legalistic strategy of, quote, fighting the regime from within the regime, promulgated by party founder Gilberto Concepcion de Garcia, had come to seem largely irrelevant to a growing number of activists. The slack in radical party politics was taken up, to a certain extent at least, by recruitment of former NPPR members into the Movimiento por Independencia Puerto Riqueño, MPIPR, headed by the avowed Marxist-Leninist Juan Mari Bras, and the emergence of Partido Socialista Puerto Riqueño, PSP. It was at this juncture that the FBI implemented a formal COINTELPRO with the expressed intent of bolstering the U.S. colonial grip on Puerto Rico through the expedient of destroying virtually the entire spectrum of left opposition on the island. In a memorandum to the SAC, San Juan, on August 5, 1960, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover announced that the Bureau was considering the new COINTELPRO and stipulated he was no longer interested in operations which involved quote-unquote mere harassment. San Juan complied, at least on the level of planting disinformation in the island press, as is indicated in the accompanying letter from Hoover to the SAC dated November 14th, but referring to a October 26, 1960 communication from San Juan, in which the director critiques a fabricated news story. In the same missive, Hoover recommends gearing up the COINTELPRO using already existing infiltrators within quote-unquote groups seeking independence for Puerto Rico in the role of provocateurs. The director felt that quote-unquote carefully selected informants might be able to raise controversial issues within independista formations such as the MPIPR, as they were even then doing within the CP-USA, and preparing to do within the SWP. Further, he pointed out that such individuals might be utilized effectively to create situations in which nationalist elements could be pitted against the communist elements to disrupt some of the organizations, particularly the MPIPR and FUPI. He also instructed that the San Juan office should be constantly alert for articles extolling the virtues of Puerto Rico's relationship to the United States as opposed to complete separation from the United States for use in anonymous mailings to selected subjects in the independence movement who may be psychologically affected by such information. As can be seen in the next document, the New York field office, in cooperation with San Juan, had responded with a concrete action proposal within 48 hours. Within months, San Juan was reporting back regularly on the relative success of its various counterintelligence operations, such as in the accompanying November 1960 memo describing the planting of an editorial in the San Juan daily, El Mundo, and other actions, and receiving a steady flow of suggestions from Hoover as to how to improve the COINTELPRO's effectiveness. By late 1967, the director was positively jubilant in his assessment to the San Juan SAC of the benefits accruing from such tactics. The COINTELPRO has served to confuse the independentist leaders, exploit group rivalries and jealousies, inflame personality conflicts, emasculate the strength of these organizations, and thwart any possibility of pro-independence unity. In achieving the results which so delighted the director, the San Juan SAC had first and foremost taken a tip from Hoover that the PSI, Public Security Index, is interested in publishing anti-communist articles, particularly those which could expose pro-Cuban and communist influence in the various national independence organizations in Puerto Rico. The process of this program are to disrupt the activities and lessen the influence of nationalists and communists who seek to separate Puerto Rico from the United States. The COINTELPRO thus included a full-scale disinformation component by which agents systematically planted articles and editorials, often containing malicious gossip concerning independentista leaders' alleged sexual or financial affairs, in friendly newspapers, and dispensed private warnings to the owners of island radio stations that their FCC licenses might be revoked if pro-independence material were aired. The articles and editorials were placed mainly in El Mundo, a Spanish-language daily dating back to the early part of this century and owned since the 1960s by North American Mrs. Argentina Hills, the 1977 and 78 president of the Inter-American Press Association, a U.S.-fomented association of newspaper owners in this hemisphere. El Mundo is also one of the Knight U.S. chain of newspapers. The San Juan Star, a Scripps Howard U.S. chain newspaper, and El Imparcial, in its latter days after the death of its pro-independence owner, Sir Ayuso, were also used to plant articles and editorials. Other less prominent newspapers like El Vigia, the University of Puerto Rico's Catholic youth organ, and the so-called Bohemia Libre Puerto Riqueña, well described by the Bureau as an anti-communist and anti-Cuban publication, were also used to disseminate the accusation that FUPI was communist and thus scare other university students away from joining it. Concerning radio programming, there is clear evidence that agents talked to the owners of radio stations WLEO in Ponce, WKFE in Yauco, and WJRS in San Germain about their licensing as early as 1963. One result was cancellation of the 1-hour daily time block allotted to Radio Bandera, a program produced by the APU. Such tactics to deny a media voice to independentistas accord well with other, more directly physical methods employed during the 1970s after COINTELPRO supposedly ended. There was the bombing of Claridad, daily paper first of the MPI-PR and then the PSP printing presses, which has occurred at least 5 times in the present decade. Although the MPI, now PSP, usually furnished the police with detailed information as to the perpetrators of these acts, not even one trial has ever been held on this island in connection with these bombings. nor even one arrest made. The same holds true for a 1973 bombing of the National Committee of the PIP. Operating in this sort of curtailment and exposure of valid independentista views, the FBI was able to sow discord and factionalism within and between targeted groups much more effectively, beginning with FUPI and the MPPR in 1960 through the APU in 1962 and 1963, and later Ligua Socialista Puertorriqueña, the MPI, and the PIP. In order to accomplish this, as the accompanying June 12, 1961 memo from the San Juan SAC to Hoover indicates, the Bureau engaged in intensive investigation of independentista leaders both on the island and in New York in order to ascertain their real or arguable weaknesses in terms of morals, criminal records, spouses, children, family life, educational qualifications, and personal activities other than independence activities. The findings, however, flimsy or contrived, were pumped into the media, disseminated as bogus cartoons or political broadsides, and or surfaced within organizational context by provocateurs, all with the express intent of setting the leaders one against the other and at odds with their respective organizational memberships. The Bureau assessed such undertakings as being quite successful, a matter witnessed by the accompanying airtel from Hoover to the SAC San Juan dated March 9, 1962, in which distribution of a bogus leaflet accusing the FUPI leadership of secret links to communism is discussed. When evidence to support such rebating contentions could not be discovered, the FBI's COINTELPRO specialist simply made it up. MPIPR leaders, cognizant of the basic antipathy of Puerto Ricans, predominantly Roman Catholic, to communism, have consistently avoided at times through public statements any direct, overt linkage of the MPIPR to communism. The San Juan office feels that the above situation can be exploited by means of a counterintelligence letter, purportedly by an anonymous veteran MPIPR member. This letter would alert MPIPR members to a probable communist takeover of the organization. Such methods were routinely employed against all independentista organizations, as is shown in the accompanying memo from the San Juan SAC to Hoover dated November 21, 1962, and targeting the APU. Things also assumed a highly personal tone, as when in 1966 an unidentified agent dummied up a letter to MPIPR head Juan Maribras, quote-unquote, warning him to beware the ambitiousness of a younger colleague. By 1968, such tactics had evolved to the point that Maribras was being accused in Bureau-fabricated leaflets and cartoons of, quote, sending young men out to die as members of the Comandos Armados de Liberación, CAL, an armed formation whose dedication was often misused by the FBI for such propaganda purposes, while he remained protected by his foreign benefactor, supposedly Cuban Premier Fidel Castro. These methods were used not only to divide Puerto Ricanos among themselves, but to forestall alliances between any of the various elements of the independentista movement and progressive groups on the U.S. mainland. For instance, when the Black liberation journal Soul Book published an editorial entitled The Puerto Rican Revolution in 1965, arguing that the Puerto Ricanos and mainland Afro-Americans shared both a common heritage and a common oppressor, COINTELPRO experts in New York saw to it that anonymous and thoroughly racist letters of objection were immediately dispatched to the MPIPR. We resent the implication that, name deleted, black nationalist allies in the editor's statement that our people are Negro, as was our martyred leader Pedro Albizu Campos. We are proud of our Spanish heritage and culture. Although Negroes are welcome in our movement and may seek refuge in our nation, let it not be said that the majority of Puerto Ricanos are Negro. On October 23, 1967, the New York SAC also came forth with a plan to disseminate a forged leaflet in the name of Juan Mari Bras and designed to misrepresent the MPIPR in such a way as to alienate a number of stateside organizations: Youth Against War and Fascism, the Progressive Labor Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, Movimiento por Independencia, Casa Puerto Rico, the Workers' World Party, and Young Socialist Alliance among them, with which Mari Bras had been attempting to forge a united front. Similarly, the Bureau sought to thwart any possibility of a constructive relationship between independentistas in socialist countries or liberation movements located outside the U.S. By 1966, the FBI was preoccupied with statements made by Mari Bras covering efforts to gain independence for Puerto Rico through the United Nations, support of the Cuban government, and the South Vietnam Liberation Front, Viet Cong. One response to this threat was the preparation and distribution of a cartoon purporting to show Mari Bras and other MPIPR leaders under the direct control of Castro. Other efforts in this vein included a campaign of sexual slander targeting Doña Laura Meneses, wife of Albizu Campos, and Juan Uribe y Uribe, MPPR delegate for external affairs. Both were living in Havana at the time, for purposes of ridiculing the Puerto Rican independence movement and the government of Fidel Castro. By 1971, the Bureau was even undertaking COINTELPRO actions to prevent a link-up between the essentially defunct Communist Party USA on the basis that CP leader Gus Hall had traveled to Puerto Rico, raised the priority of Puerto Rican independence for his party, and promised to champion the cause when he traveled to the USSR and other socialist countries. Predictably, the sorts of manipulations involved in the COINTELPRO against the Puerto Rican independence movement entailed more than the fostering of confusion and infighting among independentistas and the public at large. There can be no doubt that lethal outcomes were acceptable to, even desired by, the FBI. For example, as the accompanying excerpt from a July 1964 memo from the San Juan SAC to Hoover bears out, the Bureau considered Mari Bras' near fatal heart attack during April of that year to have been brought on, at least in part, by an anonymous counterintelligence letter. Far from expressing regret or concern that perhaps the FBI was overstepping its intentions in light of these consequences, the SAC concludes by promising to be on the lookout to exploit our achievements in this field in the future and to advise the Bureau of other positive results of the COINTELPRO in Puerto Rico. The pattern remained evident more than a decade later when, as Mari Bras subsequently testified before the United Nations Commission on Decolonization after reviewing portions of the 75 volumes of documents the FBI had compiled on him, the Bureau undertook tactics apparently intended to cause him to suffer a second coronary. The documents reflect the general activity of the FBI toward the movement, but some of the memos are dated 1976 and 1977, long after COINTELPRO was supposedly ended as an FBI activity. At one point, there is a detailed description of the death of my son in 1976 at the hands of a gun-toting assassin. The bottom of the memo is fully deleted, leaving one to wonder who the assassin was. The main point, however, is that the memo is almost joyful about the impact his death will have upon me in my gubernatorial campaign as head of our party in 1976. After this impact expressed itself in the form of an attack of severe depression the same year, the San Juan SAC noted in a memo to FBI headquarters that it would hardly be idle boasting to say that some of the Bureau's activities have provoked the situation of Mari Bras. Obviously, one possible interpretation of this language is that the FBI had a hand in orchestrating the murder of the MPIPR leader's son, or at least help cover the trail of the assassins. Given the context established by the Bureau's own statements vis-a-vis Mari Bras, It also seems quite likely that one of the means by which the FBI continued to exploit its achievements in provoking the situation of the independentista leader was to arrange for the firebombing of his home in 1978, in addition to maintaining such normal investigative harassment as obtaining copies of every single deposit slip and check written on his personal account for more than 20 years. Plainly, the lethal or near lethal dimension of the Puerto Rico COINTELPRO expanded dramatically during the 1970s after such operations had been allegedly terminated, as Alfredo Lopez recounted in 1988. Over the past 15 years, 170 attacks, beatings, shootings, and bombings of independence organizations and activists have been documented. There have been countless attacks and beatings of people at rallies and pickets, to say nothing of the independentistas walking the streets. The 1975 bombing of a rally at Mayagüez that killed 2 restaurant workers was more dramatic, but like the other 170 attacks, remains unsolved. Although many right-wing organizations claimed credit for these attacks, not one person has been arrested or brought to trial. This pattern of seeming ineffectuality on the part of the FBI and cooperating local police agencies when it comes to solving violent crimes against groups or individuals targeted by COINTELPRO is revealing in a way which will be explored more thoroughly in our chapter on the Bureau's anti-AIM operations. Suffice to say that there can be no question that lack of manpower accounts for such apparent ineptitude. By the 1970s, the FBI's San Juan field office was rostered with 4 squads, about 80 agents, with another squad posted to each of the 3 resident agencies, and additional 60 agents overall, exclusive of a steady flow of technicians from the mainland brought in to perform one or another quote-unquote special task, all interlocked tightly with the island's substantial local police force. Further, the Bureau is known to have customarily shared information and coordinated activities on the island with the CIA, Secret Service, Naval Intelligence Service, 771st Military Intelligence Detachment, the State Department, and Office of Naval Intelligence, all of which remain facilities and appreciable numbers of personnel on site in Puerto Rico. All of this adds up to an incredible saturation of agents on a small Caribbean island with an aggregate population of only 3.5 million. And while the Bureau can't seem to muster the wherewithal to apprehend any of the perpetrators of the beatings and bombings of the independentistas, it has always had ample resources available to engage in anti-independentista gossip and editorializing, keeping track of Mari Bra's checkbook, and arresting numerous FUPI students engaged in distributing pro-independence literature on such weighty charges as, quote, possessing marijuana cigarettes. In those few instances when the FBI did actually become involved in the investigation of the murders of independentistas during the 1970s, the results have been bizarre. For example, when Teamster activist Juan Caballero disappeared in 1977, the Bureau atypically joined in the search for him. On October 25th, a body was found in the El Yunque rainforest, badly decomposed and trussed up in electrical wire. This, the FBI announced, was Caballero, who had probably been killed by associates, who suspected him of having been a police informant. No such suspicion had existed prior to the Bureau's announcing it. Then mysteriously it was discovered that the dental structure of the corpse failed to match that of Caballero. Further tests revealed that the body lacked evidence of a bone fracture in the right hand the ostensible victim was known to have suffered. The fingers of a hand were then severed and shipped to the FBI crime lab in Washington, D.C. for fingerprint identification. The lab promptly lost the fingers. The fate of Juan Caballero thus remains unknown, as does the identity of the individual actually murdered in El Yunque. Equally novel have been the techniques by which the Bureau has amassed evidence of alleged independentista violence. Take for instance the case of the hopping fingerprint after the shooting of North American attorney Alan Randall in September 1977. Shortly after the killing, a communique was supposedly received from a workers' commando taking credit for the action and explaining the rationale underlying it. A follow-up communique was said to have been received within a matter of hours. 2 days later, local police, acting on information provided by the FBI, arrested Island Teamster head Miguel Cabrera and several other key union organizers. Cabrera's fingerprint, the Bureau said, had been found on the first communique. At a pre-trial hearing during January of 1978, however, the prosecution produced Bureau-provided evidence that Cabrera's fingerprint was on the second communique rather than the first, thus producing the joke among the defendants that the print was busily hopping from document to document in the FBI crime lab. During the trial in 1979, police records were subpoenaed by the defense, which showed that the Bureau had requested a set of Cabrera's prints prior to receiving any evidence in the case, a matter which strongly suggested the crime lab's conclusions had been predetermined. As a result, Cabrera and his colleagues were acquitted. A much clearer instance of direct FBI involvement in an anti-independentista violence is the Cerro Maravilla episode of July 25, 1978. On that date, two young activists, Arnaldo Dario Rosado and Carlos Soto Arrivi, son of the distinguished Puerto Rican novelist Pedro Juan Soto, accompanied a provocateur named Alejandro Gonzalez Molave, were lured into a trap and shot to death by police near the mountain village. Official reports claimed the pair had been on the way to blow up a television tower near Cerro Maravilla and had fired first when officers attempted to arrest them. A taxi driver who was also on the scene, however, adamantly insisted that this was untrue, that neither independentista had offered resistance when captured, and that the police themselves had fired 2 volleys of shots in order to make it sound from a distance as if they had been fired upon. It was a planned murder, the witness said, and it was carried out like that. What had actually happened became even more obvious when a police officer named Julio Cesar Andrades came forward and asserted that the assassination had been planned from on high and in collaboration with the Bureau. This led to confirmation of Gonzalez Molave's role as an infiltrator, reporting to both the local police and the FBI, a situation which prompted him to admit having planned and urged the bombing in order to set the 2 young victims up for execution. In the end, it was shown that Dario and Soto had surrendered. Police forced the men to their knees, handcuffed their arms behind their backs, and as the 2 independentistas pleaded for justice, the police tortured and murdered them. None of the police and the other officials involved were ever convicted of the murders and crimes directly involved in this sordid affair. However, despite several years of systematic cover-up by the FBI and U.S. Justice Department working in direct collaboration with the guilty cops, 10 of the latter were finally convicted on multiple counts of perjury and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 6 to 30 years apiece. Having evaded legal responsibility for his actions altogether, provocateur Gonzalez Molave was shot to death in front of his home on April 29, 1986, by quote-unquote party or parties unknown. This was followed on February 28, 1987, by the government's payout of $575,000 settlements to both victims' families, a total of $1.15 million in acknowledgement of the official misconduct attending their deaths and the subsequent investigations. At about the same time that Dario and Soto was summarily executed, August 28th to September 1st, 1978, the FBI was hosting an international conference on counterterrorism in San Juan. Among the participants in this 3-day event were Anthony Quinton, then head of the State Department's Office on Combating Terrorism, British General Richard Clutterbuck, a specialist in counterinsurgency theory and author of several books on the subject. Uruguayan General Manuel Quirello, head of the 1960s campaign that destroyed the Tupamaros guerrillas. Reinhard Ruprecht, a head of the West German Bundeskriminalamt and responsible for pursuit of the Red Army Fraction, RAF. Robin Bourne, Canadian head of the campaign to repress the Quebec Liberation Movement. Inspector Ronald McIntyre of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Canada's FBI. Jay Mallon, editor for Terrorism in Latin America with Soldier of Fortune magazine. Dr. Aaron Katz of the Center for the Study of Human Behavior, a RAND-type think tank devoted to counterinsurgency research. And Louis O. Jafrida, a quote-unquote private sector specialist involved in delivering counter-terrorist, counterinsurgency, and SWAT training to law enforcement personnel. In addition, the meeting was attended by several high-ranking FBI men, including COINTELPRO specialist Richard Wallace Held, then Special Agent in Charge, SAC, of the Bureau's San Juan Field Office. One result of the conference seems to have been the designation of a mainland formation of the Independentista movement, the Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional, FALN, along with three other national liberation organizations, the Republic of New Africa, RNA, Movimiento de Liberación Nacional Mexico, MLNM, and the American Indian Movement, as the most significant current internal security threats to the United States. A more concrete outcome was a massive island-wide raid conducted by more than 300 SWAT-equipped agents beginning before dawn on the morning of August 30th, 1985. Operating out of the Roosevelt Roads Naval Base, the raiders invaded scores of homes and offices, arresting nearly 50 independentistas on quote-unquote John Doe warrants in which charges were not specified. Considerable personal property was destroyed, impounded, or lost. The raid was initially justified by San Juan SAC Richard W. Held on the basis of anti-terrorism, evidenced in the arrest of 11 independentistas, including Filiberto Ojeda Rios, a leader of Los Macheteros, a clandestine organization said to have been involved in the expropriation of $7.1 million from a Wells Fargo facility in West Hartford, Connecticut on September 12, 1983. The cover story, which in any event failed to explain why 37 other independentistas, none of whom were accused of specific criminal acts, had been rounded up in the raid, was quickly belied by the U.S. Attorney in Puerto Rico. "You have to remember," he said at a press conference, "there were two simultaneous investigations going on. There was the West Hartford investigation and the one going on down here." His boss, U.S. Attorney General Edwin Meese, was even more straightforward. "We are sending a message to terrorists that their bloody acts will not be tolerated." Thus, mere public advocacy of independence for Puerto Rico was converted into terrorism and utilized as the basis for the continuation of COINTELPRO under the rhetoric veneer of counter-terrorist operations. What had happened was seen quite plainly on the island by nearly everyone, including relatively establishment-oriented politicians. PIP leader Ruben Berrios Martinez, for instance, termed the whole affair a frontal attack on an entire movement and an entire set of ideals. "It is virtually an act of war upon our people's will, determination, and rights." Even Governor Carlos Barcelo Romero, no friend of the independentistas, formally protested the trampling upon Puerto Rico's constitution inherent to the Bureau's brand of counterintelligence activity. The governor was saying more than he intended. Inevitably, the FBI's concerted efforts to repress the independentista perspective in Puerto Rico's political life has served to deform the Puerto Rican political process as a whole. And as was the case with COINTELPRO SWP, this appears to have been quite conscious and intentional. But in Puerto Rico, the implications extend rather further. Not only did the Bureau's systematic denial of media access to, spreading of disinformation about, and fostering of factionalism within the independentista movement have the effect of negating much of the movement's electoral potential within the island arena itself, such tactics also subverted other initiatives to resolve the issue of Puerto Rico's colonial status in a peaceful fashion. This concerns, in particular, a plebiscite called for July 23, 1967. During the 10 months prior to the scheduled referendum to determine the desires of the Puerto Rican public with regard to the political status of their island, the Bureau went far out of its way to spread confusion. The COINTELPRO methods used including creation of two fictitious organizations, Grupo Pro Uso Voto del NPI, roughly group within the NPIPR in favor of voting to achieve independence, and the Committee Against Foreign Domination of the Fight for Independence, as the medium through which to misrepresent independentista positions, quote unquote, from the inside. One outcome was that the Puerto Rican voters increasingly shied away from the apparently jumbled and bewildering independentista agenda and accepted continuation of a Commonwealth status under U.S. domination which satisfied virtually none of the populace. With this accomplished, the Bureau set about seeing to it that the independentistas remained artificially discredited and the overall Puerto Rican option to mount a coherent effort to protest or reconvene the plebiscite truncated by shifting responsibility for the disaster onto its foremost victims. It might be desirable to blame the communist bloc and particularly Cuba for the failure of the United Nations and to criticize Maribras and others for isolating the Puerto Rican independence forces from the democratic countries. Since 1967, although Maribras and other independentistas have made an annual pilgrimage to the UN Committee on Decolonization and in 1978 managed to achieve formal international recognition that the island remains a colony despite designation as a commonwealth, the U.S. has been able to shunt off the issue. U.S. diplomats routinely argue that the 1967 referendum, quote unquote, permanently reaffirmed by popular consent the domestic status of Puerto Rico accepted by Muñoz Marin in 1953. This, according to the diplomats, represents the exercise of self-determination by Puerto Ricanos and renders the island's affairs an internal concern of the United States rather than a matter of international jurisdiction. And just in case the utterly contrived nature of the U.S. position failed to prove sufficiently convincing to third world nations, U.S. United Nations Ambassador John Kirkpatrick made it clear to non-aligned nations that a vote against the United States would carry penalties when the independentistas finally managed to bring their questions to the General Assembly in 1981. With literally every revenue of due and democratic process sealed off by the extra-legal methods of their colonizers, the independentistas have been left with essentially no recourse but armed struggle. Some realized this as early as the 1930s, others much later. For its part, the FBI seems to have understood from the outset that this would be the result of its mission in keeping Puerto Rico firmly within the U.S. orbit. Hence, the Bureau's early undertaking of counterintelligence operations against the MPPR and the evolution of these activities into the much more inclusive anti-independentista COINTELPRO beginning in 1960. Such an assessment also accounts for the apparent escalation of the sort of counterintelligence tactics used against the independentistas after 1971 when COINTELPRO was supposedly a thing of the past. As the events of 1985 abundantly demonstrate, in Puerto Rico the essentials of COINTELPRO remain very much alive, and under the conditions which now prevail, its continuation promises to be more treacherous and violent than ever. End of Chapter 4. Please support this channel by donating and clicking on the links below.